November 1943, a Soviet airbase near the front lines. The air is so cold it feels like breathing crushed glass. A group of Soviet VVS generals stands before a brand new arrival. It's the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. To the Americans, this is the Jug, the most powerful, high-tech, and expensive single-engine fighter on the planet. It's an 8-gun monster of polished aluminum and turbo-supercharged fury. It is the pride of Detroit's assembly lines. The Soviet general walks a slow circle around the massive fuselage. He looks at the height of the cockpit, the girth of the engine, and the sheer, bloated scale of the machine. Then he does something the American engineers would never expect. He laughs. He points a gloved finger at the pride of the U.S. Army Air Forces and calls it a letaющая butilka moloka. To the Soviets, this wasn't a war machine. It was a joke. It was too heavy, too complex, and, in their eyes, completely useless for the brutal, low-altitude knife. Fights of the Eastern Front. But now, look at this. This is the Bell P-39 Airacobra. Back in the United States, American pilots hated this plane. They called it a death trap. They claimed it tumbled out of the sky for no reason. It didn't have a turbo supercharger. It couldn't breathe at high altitudes. The RAF in Britain took one look at it and sent their entire shipment back, calling it unfit for combat. Yet here is Alexander Pokryshkin, the second highest scoring ace of the entire Soviet Union, a man who would end the war with 59 kills, looking at this American failure with genuine awe. To Pokryshkin, this wasn't a death trap. It was the most perfect aerial weapon ever forged. Why? Why did the world's two greatest air forces look at the exact same machines and see two completely different realities? How did American trash become Russian gold? Welcome back. Today, we are deconstructing one of the greatest cultural and technological collisions in military history. Not the key, Lend-Lease Paradox. Most history books tell you that Lend-Lease was an act of American charity, shipping crates of spare planes to a desperate Red Army. But the truth is far more fascinating. It was a clash of philosophies. It was a story of how a toy with a leather seat and a car door entrance became the most feared tank buster in the sky, and how the best American fighter became a glorified transport plane because it was too luxurious for the Russian mud. But there's a darker side to this story. There was a secret, a lethal engineering flaw hidden deep within the tail of the Airacobra. In the West, this flaw killed hundreds of rookie pilots in training, leading to its death trap reputation. But the Soviets, they didn't just fix it, they turned that flaw into a tactical advantage that made them nearly invincible in a dogfight. I'm going to show you exactly what that flaw was and the suicidal maneuver Russian pilots used to master it later in Chapter 3. But first, we have to understand the sheer scale of the disaster that led to these planes being sent in the first place. Because before the Russians were laughing at our toys, they were screaming for anything that could fly. This is the story of the arsenal of confusion. To understand why the Russians were laughing at American engineering, you have to understand that in 1942, the United States and the Soviet Union weren't just fighting on different fronts. They were fighting two completely different wars. The Americans were obsessed with the high game. Their doctrine was built around the strategic bomber. They wanted to fly at 30,000 feet above the clouds, where the air is thin and the oxygen is gone. Every American fighter, from the P-47 to the P-51, was designed as a high-altitude bodyguard. They had massive turbo superchargers, pressurized cabins, and wings designed for thin air performance. But the Soviets, they didn't care about 30,000 feet. On the Eastern Front, there were no strategic bombing raids. This was a low game. The war in the East was won or lost within 3,000 feet of the dirt. It was a brutal, claustrophobic brawl between tanks, artillery, and ground attack aircraft. This is where the first great Lend-Lease clash happened with the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. Now, if you're a history buff, you know the P-40 as the legendary Flying Tiger that terrorized the Japanese over China. It was a rugged, reliable hero. But when the first shipments arrived in Russia, the Soviet pilots were horrified. In the freezing Russian winter, the P-40's Allison engine was a disaster. The oil would thicken into sludge, causing the engines to literally explode on takeoff, but even when it worked, the performance was, to put it bluntly, pathetic. At 2,000 feet, where the Red Air Force lived, the P-40 was a brick with a propeller. It couldn't outclimb a Messerschmitt, and it certainly couldn't outturn one. The Russians looked at the P-40's fancy cockpit heaters and comfortable seating and shook their heads. To them, American planes weren't built for war. They were built for comfort, in a place where comfort didn't exist. But before these useless planes could even be laughed at, they had to get there. And this is a part of the war almost no one talks about, the ALSIB route. Imagine being a 19-year-old pilot. You're told to fly a single-engine fighter from Montana, through the Yukon, over the Bering Strait, and across 3,000 miles of Siberian wasteland where the temperature regularly hits 50 degrees below zero. There were no paved runways, no GPS. Often, there were no maps. If your engine sputtered over the Verkhoyansk range, you didn't just crash, you disappeared. Your plane would vanish into the permafrost, and the ice would swallow you before search teams even knew you were missing. In fact, to this day, hikers in the Russian Far East still occasionally stumble across the silver wreckage of American planes, frozen in time, with the skeletons of pilots still in the seats. The Russians who flew these planes across the ice road developed a grim sense of humor. They saw the American luxury items, the relief tubes, the padded armrests, the cigarette lighters, as proof that the Americans didn't understand the reality of the East. But then something changed. In the middle of 1942, a crate arrived containing a plane that the U.S. Army Air Corps was trying to get rid of. It was unconventional. It was weird. It was the Bell P-39 Airacobra. The Americans called it a failed experiment. But when the Soviet mechanics opened that crate and saw a 37-millimeter cannon the size of an anti-tank gun poking through the nose of the propeller, the laughing stopped. Suddenly, the toy didn't look like a toy anymore. It looked like a surgeon's scalpel in a world of sledgehammers. But there was a catch. To unlock the power of the Cobra, the Russians had to survive a flaw so deadly, American pilots refused to fly it. I'm talking about the flat spin of death. And in the next chapter, I'll show you why the very thing that killed Americans was exactly what made the Russians the deadliest pilots in the sky. If you want to understand why the Americans hated the P-39 and the Russians worshipped it, you have to look at its anatomy. Most fighters of World War II are built like a dart. Heavy engine in the front, pilot in the middle, tail in the back. But the Bell P-39 was built like a mid-engine supercar. The engineers at Bell had a radical idea. What if we take a massive 37-millimeter T-9 cannon, a gun usually reserved for light tanks, and build a plane around it? To make room for the gun in the nose, they shoved the engine behind the pilot. A long drive shaft actually ran between the pilot's legs to spin the propeller. On paper, it was genius. It gave the pilot incredible visibility and made the nose light and lethal. But in practice, for American pilots, it was a nightmare. See, because the engine was in the center, the plane's center of gravity was incredibly sensitive. If you pushed it too hard in a turn, the P-39 wouldn't just stall, it would tumble. It would enter a flat spin that was almost impossible to recover from. American test pilots called it unstable. They complained the 37-millimeter cannon jammed after 3 shots. They hated the car-style doors because you couldn't bail out easily in an emergency. To the U.S. Army Air Corps, the P-39 was a rejected experiment. They practically couldn't give them away fast enough. But then, these rejects arrived in the hands of men like Alexander Pokryshkin. The Soviets looked at the P-39 and didn't see a tumbler. They saw a sniper rifle. You see, the Americans were trying to dogfight with the P-39 at 20,000 feet, where its engine gasped for air. But the Russians, They stayed low, and at low altitude, that mid-engine design turned the Cobra into the most agile knife fighter in the sky. As for the tumbling problem, the Soviet pilots realized that if you mastered the spin, you could use the plane's instability to snap-turn faster than any Messerschmitt on the planet. They didn't fear the flaw, they weaponized it. This is where Pokryshkin changed aerial warfare forever. He developed a four-step tactical doctrine that he forced every one of his pilots to memorize. Speed, maneuver, height, fire. 1. Speed. Use the P-39's clean aerodynamics to dive. 2. Maneuver. Use that mid-engine agility to get on the tail. 3. Height. Always keep a reserve of altitude to convert into energy. 4. Fire. And this was the kicker. While American pilots preferred spraying with 6.50 caliber machine guns, the Russians were marksmen. Pokryshkin rewired the controls so that one trigger pulled all guns at once. He told his pilots, "Don't fire until you can see the rivets on his wings." When that 37mm cannon hit a German plane, it didn't just poke a hole, it deleted the aircraft. One hit to a wing spar, and the wing would simply vanish. One hit to the engine, and the plane would disintegrate in mid-air. This brings us to Grigory Reshkalov. If Pokryshkin was the brain of the Airacobra, Reshkalov was its soul. Reshkalov ended the war with 56 kills, nearly all of them in the P-39. There's a famous story from late in the war. The Soviet High Command finally produced the Yak-3 and the Law-7, incredible homegrown Russian fighters that were technically superior to the aging American P-39s. They went to Reshkalov and his regiment and said, "Comrades, congratulations. We are taking away your old American toys and giving you the best Russian tech." Reshkalov flatly refused. He told his commanders that he would rather fly an obsolete American P-39 than the newest Russian jet. Why? Because he knew the machine. He had learned to dance with its death spin. He knew that the 37mm cannon in his nose was the only thing the Luftwaffe truly feared. He stayed in his Airacobra until the very last day of the war. Think about that. One of the greatest aces in history trusted his life to a plane his own allies called junk. But as the war dragged on, the Americans sent something else, something bigger, something the Russians called the flying milk bottle. And if the P-39 was a sniper rifle, this new plane was a sledgehammer that the Russians didn't know how to swing. In the next chapter, we're going to find out why the Russians thought the P-47 was a toy for cowards, until they found its one secret use that saved the Soviet heartland. If the P-39 was a surgical scalpel, the P-47 Thunderbolt was a 7-ton sledgehammer. When the first P-47s rolled off the transport ships in 1943, the Soviet ground crews gathered around in genuine disbelief. They didn't see a fighter, they saw a target. To the Russian eye, the P-47 was impossibly bloated. It was twice the weight of their own fighters. They looked at the massive radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, and the complex turbo supercharging system that took up half the fuselage, and they coined the nickname that stuck, the flying milk bottle. But the joke turned into a tragedy the first time a Soviet pilot tried to use it like a Russian fighter. Imagine this. You are a Soviet pilot used to the Yak-3, a plane made of wood and fabric that can turn on a dime at 2,000 feet. You're flying a P-47 over the mud of the Eastern Front. A German Messerschmitt 109 bounces you. You pull back on the stick to engage in a horizontal turn fight. It's a disaster. In the thick, heavy air near the ground, the P-47 is a brick. It's like trying to perform a delicate ballet in a semi-truck while your opponent is on a motorcycle. The Russian pilots complained that by the time they finished a single bank, the German had already looped around and shot them 3 times. They hated the wide wingspan. They hated the slow roll rate at low altitudes. One Soviet test pilot famously remarked that the P-47 was excellent for everything except fighting. But then there was the toy aspect. This is where the quote in our title comes from. Soviet pilots, men who flew in unheated cockpits with wooden seats and literally wore sheepskin rugs to keep from freezing, climbed into the P-47 and were baffled. It had a heater that actually worked. It had a comfortable, adjustable leather seat. It even had a relief tube, a luxury unheard of in the Red Air Force. To a man whose life expectancy was measured in weeks, these weren't features. They were toys. They thought the Americans were soft. They laughed because they believed the U.S. had built a luxury car instead of a war machine. However, the laughing eventually stopped. The Soviets realized they were using the tool wrong. While the P-47 failed as a low-level dogfighter, the VVS discovered it had one superpower. It could breathe where no Soviet plane could. The Soviet Union had a massive problem with high-altitude German reconnaissance planes. The Ju-86s that flew so high, the Yaks and La-5s would literally stall out trying to reach them. Enter the P-47. With its massive turbo supercharger, the milk bottle was the only thing in the Russian inventory that could comfortably sit at 30,000 feet. The P-47 became the high-altitude watchman. It was pulled from the front lines and sent to the PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces. They used these American toys to guard Moscow and Leningrad, sitting miles above the earth, waiting in their heated leather seats to pounce on the high-flying Germans. The toy had found its niche, but as the war reached its final act, the greatest mystery of Lend-Lease was yet to come. A plane that America loved so much they built thousands of them, but never let a single American pilot fly them into combat. As the war entered its final year, the relationship between American engineering and Soviet grit reached its strange, logical conclusion. Meet the Bell P-63 King Cobra. This is a plane that almost no American pilot has ever flown in combat. It was a 400-mile-per-hour ghost. The U.S. Army Air Forces looked at the test data and said, "No thanks." But they didn't cancel the order. Instead, they kept the factories running 24/7 to build a plane specifically for a foreign power. Out of the 3,300 King Cobras built, nearly 2,400 went straight to the Soviet Union. It was the ultimate custom-made weapon, an American aircraft designed for a Russian war. It had the 37-millimeter cannon they loved, the low-altitude speed they craved, and the rugged landing gear that could handle a runway made of frozen mud and broken dreams. But this brings us to the big question, the moral reframe of this entire saga. For decades, Western history books hinted that the Soviets were picky, or that American planes were bad. But that's not the truth. The truth is a lesson in environment versus engineering. An American plane was a piece of high-precision jewelry. It was designed for a world of logistical perfection, high-octane fuel, and 30,000-foot vistas. A Soviet plane was a bayonet. It was designed to be fixed with a hammer in a blizzard. When you put a piece of jewelry in a street fight, it breaks. When you take a bayonet to a high-society duel, it looks crude. Neither was wrong. They were simply built for different worlds. But let's talk about the emotional high that history often ignores. In the winter of 1942, the Soviet Union was bleeding out. The Luftwaffe owned the skies. The Great Patriotic War was teetering on a knife's edge. During those darkest months, these American toys didn't just provide numbers, they provided hope. When Pokryshkin and his Cobra pilots tore through the German formations over the Kuban, it wasn't just a tactical victory. It was the moment the Red Air Force realized they could not just survive, but dominate. Those 18,000 American aircraft weren't just Lend-Lease shipments. They were the oxygen that kept the Soviet heart beating while it learned how to fight back. So, what if? What if the U.S. had listened to the RAF and the disgruntled test pilots at Wright Field? What if they had stopped production of the failed P-39 in 1941? Without the Airacobra, the Soviet Union loses its most effective air superiority fighter of the mid-war period. The German Stukas continue to dive-bomb Soviet tanks with impunity. The siege of Stalingrad might have ended with a different flag over the ruins. It is entirely possible that without America's trash, the Eastern Front would have collapsed. Today, when you see a P-39 in a museum in Moscow or Monino, it doesn't feel like a foreign object. To the veterans who still visit, it's not an American plane. It's a Russian hero. It's the machine that took their boys to Berlin. It's the toy that grew up to kill the Reich. It's a reminder that in war, the best weapon isn't the most expensive one or the one with the most leather in the cockpit. The best weapon is the one that shows up when the world is on fire and says, "I'm ready, let's go to work." So I want to hear from you. In a life or death struggle, which do you value more? The rugged, deadly if you misstep simplicity of the P-39, or the high-tech, luxury safety of the P-47? Does comfort make a pilot better, or does it make them soft? Let's argue about it in the comments below. And if you want to see what happened when a pilot stole a German fighter just to get home, check out the video on the screen right now. I'm WW2 Vales, and I'll see you in the next one.